Latinx, and LGBTQIA+ student oppressions. Our learning objectives today will be to frame structural oppression, define concrete pathways towards equity, connect intersecting narratives of trauma, and apply that to the framework of structural humility. We'll be looking at a framework for structural oppression and applying that to the experiences of students and thinking about ways in which to serve students' needs in relation to how they experience structural oppression, specifically focusing on students of African descent, Latin descent, and from the LGBTQIA+ community. So I present this graphic as the framework that will be guiding this presentation, where we see structural oppression as an umbrella that structures historical trauma, microaggressions, implicit bias, disparity, and institutional oppression. And I want to begin by talking about structural oppression. When we look at the identity groups, the African-American groups, Latinx, and LGBTQIA, it's important to recognize their unique histories, their cultural considerations, legal implications that shape their lived experience, and what equity might look like. So in this case, I want to first recognize the COVID-19 death disparity. When we look at the disparity of death when it comes to COVID-19 and the way in which it disproportionately impacts Black lives, one of the conversations that has been current within contemporary discourse is simply that it is a cause of underlying health conditions. But when we dig a little bit deeper and we understand what these underlying health conditions are, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, et cetera, it's important to think about how these are rooted within systemic racism. When we look at redlining, we find that contemporary Black households are more likely to be located in areas where we have high air toxins, air particulates, contaminated water, food deserts, and those things increase the likelihood of diabetes, hypertension, and asthma, the same health conditions that put people at greater risk for COVID-19. Essentially, when we have a historical event like COVID-19, it's important to recognize that they will disproportionately impact more vulnerable populations. So when we see things like disparity of death and unemployment rate, it's important to think about structural racism. And later we'll be talking about what it means to create structural interventions to structural problems. When we look at the Latinx community, anti-immigrant sentiment is a reality that even citizens of the United States face. Essentially, it's being assumed the other and being treated as such through a nationalist-oriented racism. In the same regard, we can say that the experience of systemic colorblind racism impacts the lived experience of the Black community in ways that shape their interpersonal interactions and interactions with institutions. For the LGBTQIA+ community, the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016 offers another example, or a more contemporary example, of post-civil rights history. In that sense, we see an issue of violence disproportionately impacting the LGBT community, and particularly at a nightclub that was created for LGBTQIA people of color. And the way in which that violence resounds with that community is it reflects a type of structural violence that people have experienced. One thing about structural oppression is that structural violence and physical violence are in direct communication. Essentially, the physical violence can be legitimated through the minds of those committing it through the reproduction of structural violence. Simply, if we devalue groups of individuals in certain ways through institutional interactions and interpersonal interactions, is going to reproduce that devaluation and oftentimes resulting in violence. In the heteronormativity and cisgender sexism that the LGBTQIA plus community experience normalizes homophobia and transphobia in a way that allows that type of oppression to then be reproductive. The legal implications for Black, Latinx, and LGBTQIA are going to be the school to prison pipeline, family separation policy, and the reality that members of the LGBTQIA population can be fired from their job in 26 states in the United States of America. So what equity would look like would be reparations, social political decolonization, and the overhaul to social political barriers that dictate the interactions and lived experience of the LGBTQIA plus population. And the reality with structural oppression is that it structures microaggressions. Again, this is a reproductive reality whereby structural oppression then structures interpersonal interactions within, which then are experienced through microaggressions. And when we think about what that might look like in the classroom, it's the use of coded language that produce stress and anxiety. Oftentimes, Black, Brown, and LGBT students are put in the position to encounter language that defines their group identity for them. And that leads them to face what we call stereotype threat, where people have to defend themselves and their identities based on popular stereotypes that are used to define them. And that anxiety that they experience within that process of having to define themselves in face of stereotypes then creates a situation where they're less likely to function in a competitive or in an affirming environment. And that anxiety and that stress that's introduced within oftentimes learning environments then shapes success patterns. One thing that we don't do with the LGBTQIA population in particular is look at success. We're not necessarily stratifying data collection in a way where we can see how bullying, how coming into one's identity, how those things impact student success. And because of that, it's difficult to develop appropriate responses to the LGBT achievement gap. But ultimately, this process from microaggressions to stereotype threat to confirmation bias, where the anxiety that students experience based on their structural vulnerability or being a part of marginalized populations, then ultimately leads to disparity and therefore confirms that bias and confirms the reality or perceived reality of microaggressions, and then that system simply reproduces itself. And if we think about this from a historical lens, it's important to consider the type of trauma that people experience. And it's not necessarily the trauma that is in the past. We're not talking about the Bracero program or the fact that when Cesar Chavez marched through Davis, California, students threw eggs at him. We're talking about how things like that reproduce themselves in a contemporary history where we're looking at those who don't belong in the United States, those who are broken from their families, and those who are perceived to, because they look like them, are treated differently. And it becomes, again, historically reproductive because of the structure of oppression. And we can say the same thing when it comes to our post-civil rights movement, and we can say the same thing when it comes to the realities experienced by the LGBTQIA population, because after gay marriage was approved, we also see the fact that married couples are still subject to violent assaults when simply being themselves in public, where people don't recognize that love is love. And that historical trauma is ultimately an intergenerational narrative. That intergenerational narrative is simply a reality where generations experience sustainable oppression that reproduces itself across generations. However, we rationalize it and allow it to evolve typically because we assume that what happens in the past, because it isn't happening as we understand it in the present, therefore it doesn't exist. And that type of ideology helps to reproduce a narrative of oppression that becomes intergenerational. And it creates post-traumatic moments within contemporary settings based on a long history of oppressive conditions. For the Black community, this began with slavery and dehumanization. In a sense, slavery created a devaluation of Black life that was dictated by legal and social practices that were able to reproduce structural violence in a contemporary setting. It leads to colorblind racism. For the Latinx community, it's important to recognize that Spanish was the first language spoken, or the first European language spoken in contemporary America. But we typically don't teach students that. And that in and of itself creates a microaggression, what we call a microinvalidation. Even further, when we think about the Native American languages that were lost, aren't necessarily discussed within a contemporary lexicon, and we impart that microinvalidation within our curriculum in the way in which we expose our students to United States history. That in and of itself is a form of structural violence. And the contemporary rendition of that is what we call bendejo games. Essentially, it is the assumption that the structural violences that people experience are things that we can deflect or placate as, well, I didn't know that, or these people brought this upon themselves because they were quote unquote breaking the law, when law in and of itself isn't equally applied to all groups. So when we think about the LGBTQIA population, it's important to think about the experience of heteronormativity. Ultimately, this idea that people are created on this earth to reproduce, and those who are part of this community don't reproduce, and therefore are creating either a taboo against humanity or a sin against their creator, and then treated in ways that reflect that heteronormativity or that standard that they will never be able to achieve. In the same way, colorblind racism works that way, where we assume that equality exists, and therefore those who haven't achieved it are ultimately not achieving it based on their own merit. Structural violence, again, rationalizes disparity in a way that allows it to reproduce itself. And heteronormative cisgender sexism works in the same way, where the normative is heterosexual, cisgender. And that normative then creates a sense of, or a perception of deviance for those who don't achieve it. So these become standards that those who can't achieve them are treated as though they are deficient. And this deficient then, similar to the cycle that came in the previous slide, then reproduces itself by creating a form of anxiety that these groups experience through historical trauma. And then that historical trauma then creating a stereotype threat or an outcome that confirms the initial bias. And this, again, reproduces itself through history. Which leads us to implicit bias, which is also historically driven. And I like to begin with a personal narrative to that end. In 1997, I was a middle school student. And at my middle school in Lakewood, California, the principal approached me after being sent to her office and told me that I should drop out of school. Her reason behind me dropping out of school was because I was consistently sent to her office. And people like me are a waste of taxpayer dollars, as she eloquently put it. And I'm bringing this story simply to create an opportunity to think about, well, me, I currently have a doctorate, um, and I think that if I would have taken her well-intended advice, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. But it's important to think about what type of biases this educator had, because the reality is that she was probably giving me the best advice that she could, based on how she understood my lived experience. And knowing there was a number of Black and brown students who were in similar positions as me, it's important to recognize how those types of patterns in education reproduce themselves, um, through implicit bias. Essentially, implicit bias isn't something where someone just wakes up, puts on their pants one leg at a time and says, today is a great day to discriminate, the sun is shining. This is something that is rooted in people's cognition. Essentially, we have a we have competing processes within our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex where we take in information and then we categorize that information based on either a threat assessment or things that we know, that are coded within our cognitive schema. And that leads to implicit biases. And those implicit biases then dictate a response matrix, that fall under the categories of fight, freeze, flight, faint, fright, flag, that ultimately happen simultaneously. Essentially, once information comes in and we assign it within the categories presented, fight, freeze, flight, faint, fright, flag, that leads to a response that could be anywhere between the white bubbles that you see. And the reality is even this diagram is very much limited in the types of responses that ultimately reflect implicit bias. But it's also important to think about how implicit bias, and perhaps it's most important to think about how implicit bias reflects structural vulnerability. Because again, what structural racism is the reproduction of patterns through interlocking institutions, which is ultimately delivered through individuals. So what that means is that this bias response matrix ultimately reproduces the same types of disparities that have been consistent within American history, and through a more contemporary lens, lexicon that recognizes these things as bad, but at the same time, because implicit bias, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia are more reflective of social pathologies, they're very much normal within our culture and difficult to see. What we learn from implicit bias is that once we bring these things to our cognition, to the forefront of our imagination, rather than being removed, a part of our subconscious, we're able to better find ways to prevent this implicit bias matrix from being activated. And that's the idea of this presentation, is simply how do we recognize structural oppression and the types of decision matrix that it creates, and then create ways in which to prevent the reproductive system of structural oppression from redundant reproducing itself. So I'd like to introduce Kwame Ture and his definition of institutional racism. However, before I get there, I'd like to also introduce what he said in 1968 at UC Berkeley when he was asked, what is the right person's role in the Black Power movement? His answer was simply, by virtue of our humanity, Black people didn't need laws to tell them that they could eat where they wanted to eat, live where they wanted to live, and go to school where they wanted to go to school. Black people knew that by being human, they should be offered these things without having to ask. It was white people who needed the laws to tell them that Black people had these rights. And in that sense, what Stokely Carmichael rightfully recognized, or sorry, Kwame Ture rightfully recognized, was the reality that in order for laws to protect the rights of those whose rights have been denied, they needed white institutions to then enforce those laws so that whites could ultimately respect those rights. Simultaneously, the second part of his answer was that it is a role of white people to then go into their communities and educate them on the rights that are being denied Black people. So in that sense, um, there were two prongs to his answer. One, white institutions need to create a preventative mechanism to stop racial oppression. And simultaneously, white community members need to educate their communities about the ways in which those human rights are being denied. Which brings me to this quote where he says, racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms, individual whites acting against individual Blacks, and acts by the total white community against the Black community. We call these individual racism and institutional racism. The reality with both is that they're mutually validating. Um, Interpersonal racism, interpersonal sexism, interpersonal homophobia, um, interpersonal transphobia are dictated, are structured by structural oppression. The same patterns that we see through interlocking institutions then normalize the oppression to a degree where it's unrecognizable, with the exception of the individual interaction. And even at times, the individual interaction is very much rationalized within society. So in order for us to interrupt these systems of oppression, we need to first identify validating mechanisms and put preventative barriers on those processes, which again, I'll discuss a little bit later. So when we think about institutional oppression, I offer this mind map where we think about white, male-centered, cisgender heteronormativity. Um, so in this regard, it's important to think about when we teach our students who defines the definitions of curriculum, the definitions of historical figures, who has the power to set that definition, and who has the power of decision making. Currently, one of the greatest successes of education is increasing diversity of teacher composition, but that increasing diversity does not match the increasing diversity of the student body. And because of that, it's important to think about what types of hidden curriculum is then being imparted through students through the standards that exist with measurable outcomes. Ultimately, measurable outcomes create standards that the hidden curriculum then also enters through the classroom or learning environment through that same pathway. And by creating a process of socialization and of essential skills. And that essential skill set is going to be dictated by those who have the power to make decisions on what is and is not important. So when it comes to teaching students about racism, sexism, homophobia, heteronormativity, transphobia, the underrepresentation of relationships with those communities and underrepresentation in composition of those setting policy and practice ultimately reproduces this white male-centered cisgender heteronormativity. Even more so, we can say that the education system, despite its diversity, still reflects an educational apartheid. And it also dictates a opportunity structure where resources through systems of interlocking institutions have created a historical narrative where success becomes reproductive across racial lines. And when people can identify with content that reinforces that success and that reproduction. Ultimately, the goal is to create a culture of inclusion and equity. However, exclusionary practices limit what that culture looks like and who is and who isn't included and how we understand equity. So the question that we're now left with is, what do we do about it? And the framework of cultural humility offers a great intervention strategy, looking at intellectual humility, recognizing the limitations of your experiences and the things that you know, and using that to engage in a practice of self-reflection, to then recognize your own bias through self-critique, and develop culturally responsive teaching and care. How do we teach students that the first European language spoken in this region was Spanish, and how empowering that might be for, in the state of California, 54% of our student population who's Latinx. And thinking about not necessarily slavery, but the type of resilience people had to survive centuries of oppression, to still be able to develop community and still be able to develop a culture despite being oppressed so severely and for so long, and honoring that rather than the fact that they were owned historically by whites. Creating a counter narrative within the narratives that we impose on our students, then can respond to the type of care that students need by creating an affirming learning environment, and having community-based advocacy and care, essentially looking at the educational institution as a community center that ultimately responds to community needs, and then applying these four categories to institutional consistency to develop sustainable interactions that serve the greater needs of an increasingly diverse population. So now I want to take the time to think specifically and intentionally about intellectual humility. When it comes to intellectual humility, I think the easiest way to understand it is to think about having an open mind and being vulnerable, recognizing that your experiences are yours alone and don't necessarily reflect those of others, and to be vulnerable and to simply be wrong and accept that, and to not create protective barriers of egocentrism, to think reflexively, thinking about how you are positioned within any type of interaction, and then to specifically think about how that reflects your intellectual understanding of the world around you, and allow your worldview to be adaptive to the worldviews of others through theoretical openness. It is also to recognize that all knowledge is limited, and that knowledge in and of itself is going to more reflect positionality than it is fact, because in our post-fact environment, it's always important to be critical. And on the emotional side, it's important with intellectual humility to recognize our interconnectedness, to think about how we are connected with others and how biases are produced through the barriers that human groups extend across one another. When we think about intergroup conflict and even intragroup conflict, because no particular race, class, gender, sexual orientation is homogenous. To be introspective, to think about my biases, where I exist, and to think about how that impacts the things that I feel and the things that I don't allow myself to feel. Intellectual humility also allows us to think empathetically. If something that I say or experience that is not mine is harmful, it's important for me to tap into the experience of harm that I've had, and then be compassionate with how I respond to any given individual. So intellectual humility creates a framework for really going about systemic change. Simply, systemic change isn't necessarily creating policies and practices that allow us to be more inclusive. Systemic change requires revolutionary healing. It requires us to repair past damage. It requires us to recognize that the past damage is very much connected to contemporary realities that reproduce themselves across time and space, and create post-traumatic moments where it's difficult within experiencing high amounts of stress from our racialized groups, for our LGBTQIA plus community, that the mere existence of their identities was created through lenses of oppression. Simply how we understand LGBTQIA identity reflects the types of oppression that they've experienced, and putting that at the forefront of how we understand their identity and things that they go through, how we understand race is very much contingent to the racial oppressions that racialized groups have experienced. We cannot understand race without understanding racism. We cannot understand LGBTQIA identity without understanding heteronormativity, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. So coming to an interaction of structural change and using intellectual humility as the guiding framework that we develop change out of is not only important, it's necessary. It can't happen without intellectual humility, because the reality is that those who currently have powers to make decisions that impact lives are also those who have experiences that may not relate with those who are most vulnerable and those who reflect the overwhelming majority of California students. And if that's the case, then it's important for us to think about, well, from this choir that I'm now preaching to, how do we engage those who make decisions that ultimately reproduce the types of oppressions that we would like to work against? And from that perspective, recognizing that well-intended decisions can often reproduce disparities, and to validate those intentions so that we can create alternatives that meet those same objectives, then allow us to subvert the same validating processes that reproduce disparity. And that requires self-reflection. When we think about self-reflection, it's important to really think about a model of lifelong learning and self-critique, where we can recognize our own biases and the biases of others through either looking in ourselves personally or looking at the social patterns. Simply, if I recognize an achievement gap, and I also recognize that Black and Brown and LGBTQIA population students experience types of oppressions within their learning environments, then it's important for me to then create opportunities to minimize the chances of those experiencing taking place through curriculum, through professional development, through relationship building, etc. And recognize that there is no endpoint to this, that this is a sustainable process that defines my teaching philosophy, and recognizes bias embedded within curriculum and interpersonal interactions, and even the composition of teachers and decision makers that set forth statewide policy. And then developing a model for culturally responsive teaching and care, where curriculum becomes more inclusive. Again, where we think about ways in which to bring the marginalized voices within classroom settings to the center of our understanding, talking about how Spanish was the first European language used in this region, how Native American populations were ultimately decimated, but created a cultural foundation that allowed America, if not California, to thrive, to create interactions with vulnerable populations and populations that have driven California's history, so that we're not necessarily thinking about them as victims, but we're thinking about them as groups that have more than survived, that have ultimately defined what we are and who we are as a state and as a nation. to think about the social political context that school comes out of. Essentially, for someone to be able to teach someone else, there is an authority structure, and that authority structure responds to objectives and laws, um, and use that social political context to ultimately redesign interactions between and within students, teachers, and the campus as a community. Um, and then resilience. Resilience isn't just grit, it's simply how do we restore the types of hurtful impacts that students have experienced, um, and then impart that healing into their curriculum through the development of essential skills like being able to normalize conversations about racism, sexism, homophobia, being able to integrate intellectual humility into our curriculum by recognizing, let's say, the African contribution to religion or mathematics, to think about the Aztecs' contribution to astronomy, to and really reconsidering what are the key points within our curriculum where we can touch on these things and not just during Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month, but throughout the course of the year to be seamlessly integrated as much as possible throughout the curriculum and throughout the educational experience, but also to think about ACEs or emotional needs assessments. What are the types of trauma that students are experiencing? If 70% of students experience some form of trauma in their lives, then it's important to think about how can we create a type of healing throughout institutional relationships. And this isn't just primary and secondary education. This is really something that can be applied to lifelong learning models embedded within professional development, within CMEs, et cetera, that really gear towards creating an inclusive climate through intentional efforts by creating trauma-informed learning spaces and psychosocial relevant activities. Essentially, how can we create empowerment through the types of interactions that people experience? How can we create a type of creativity where people are able to explore their experiences and the knowledge that's been imparted on them to create new knowledge, to create new types of empowerment, and to create new types of relationships that haven't previously been fostered within learning environments. And that particular point leans towards community-based care and advocacy. Ultimately, how do we assess structural vulnerability that our students experience and even teachers may experience? When we think about COVID-19 and we think about homelessness within the state of California, we can expect more homelessness. We can expect housing insecurity to extend itself across populations, but particularly be rooted and most deeply experienced in Black, Latinx, and LGBT communities, particularly LGBTQIA plus youth. If 40% of LGBTQ or if 40% of youth are from the LGBTQIA population, then it's important to think about how COVID-19 will ultimately widen that gap. And to also think about environmental risk. One of the things that we're finding right now with our shelter in place policy is that domestic violence and interpartner violence are increasing alongside of unemployment rates. So doing a structural vulnerability assessment to understand how that's taking place within our institutional environments allows us to also be able to create opportunities to minimize the impact that those realities have on our student populations. Secondly, social resources. What type of relationships do institutions have with social justice organizations? How can we rethink parental engagement? In Solano County, California, there is a group created through the library called the Rainbow Reads Program. And what that is an opportunity for students to then create a reading group across the county where it focuses on literature produced by LGBT affirming individuals or LGBT allies. And what that means then is that students themselves are allowed to create a community. And that community can then create opportunities for those students that didn't previously exist. And what type of training do we have to create affirming environments so that students who are most marginalized are more capable of thriving? Also, you know, parental engagement. What type of parent communities can we create beyond, let's say, your typical PTA? Do we have uh, a group of Black parents, of Latinx parents, of parents who are concerned with homelessness? Essentially, how can we create affirming communities that respond to structural vulnerabilities in meaningful ways? And then are offered opportunities to create interactive environments that promote community, promote learning, and promote interactive training opportunities where people are able to learn essential skills beyond what any standing curriculum is able to offer. And that can only be done through community collaboration. How can we create affirming relationships with community organizations and members? How can we create co-curricular activities where students are able to apply what they're learning in the classroom to the types of interactions that they have, and what types of recognition can we have that allows us to better understand these relationships and experiences that ultimately define our learning environment. Community collaborations, social resources, and structural vulnerability assessment allow us to see things that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. And then political engagement allows us to advance ourselves in ways that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. How can we work with our teachers to better prepare them as advocates to student populations through elected officials? What type of political partnerships can we create through this sustainable process of training and then creation or moving forward of advocates to political engagement spaces? And how can we then make that sustainable through collaborative social activities that are consistent, geared towards relationship building, geared towards creating resources, and also how can those relationships be incentivized either through financial or social resources, so that way we can then be sustainable in the types of community-based care and advocacy that we seek to create. And then lastly, institutional consistency. Simply looking at those other items and then integrating them into the types of policy and practices that ultimately define our institutions, our schools as community hubs. And looking at an internal and external structural vulnerability assessment that allows us to develop community and political partnerships to make a community impact that also impacts our learning space by simply expanding it and imparting skills that are more relevant to the diversity of contemporary students, essentially creating the school as a cultural and political hub that advances community needs, creates a different type of education that is going to be more important for contemporary students than contemporary education is currently. The reality is that with more diverse populations and populations that reflect vulnerable populations or populations that are more likely to be marginalized within society, it's important that we recognize that if institutions aren't accountable to being transformative, then we must also be accountable to the fact that this educational apartheid is going to be reproductive unless we have intentional efforts. And that can only be done through advocacy, training, and political engagement um, that develop sustainable relationships that are geared towards simply taking care of our community and simply being transformative in the space that exists around the educational institution by broadening what does a learning space look like and what does it actually do. So I want to thank you all for participating in my presentation. And I will now begin a question and answer series. Hello? I cannot hear right now.
You can't hear
Oh,
because I actually had myself on mute. So I
okay.
apologize, everyone. I am the equity analyst for JSPAC, and what an incredible webinar and informative. But you do have some questions over on the side in the chat. And one statement was just about Magenti.org just released a story, a drag story time about Latinx cultural and bilingual that was suggested. And then someone mentioned, I know it's not the focus of the presentation, but it feels like it's reinforcing an invisible minority myth, not to mention, meaning COVID on Asian American populations. Will you speak on about the impacts of COVID-19 on Asian American populations?
Oh, of course. So the model minority myth, I think, is really important to kind of process how we understand contemporary racism. Essentially, the model minority creates a type of triangulation. And what that means is that because this token minority is seen as the well-to-do minority, it then is compared to the minorities that exist within the realm of disparity. And therefore, their disparity is then minimized because this particular minority group is successful. And what that ultimately does is two things. One, it minimizes the types of experiences that non-model minorities have through the tokenization of a model minority, while at the same time, it creates a situation where we can't see the types of racisms that model minorities experience. So again, it is a let's say, social pathological feature within structural racism that allows it to reproduce itself by simply obscuring the way in which racism reinvents itself. So when we, in COVID-19 creates a great opportunity to see how that plays out, because in some sense, we can look at the violence that Asian Americans have experienced as being seen as the cause for the onset of this virus. So in times of crisis, we can always recognize an extension of structural, if not physical violence. And that's things that we can see. Now, because our political discourse has blamed China, blamed San Francisco, Chinatowns as increasing the spread of this virus, then the minds of those who are in some sense a crisis response mode, violence is more likely to take place because now I have a target to then put um, my stress, my anxiety on, because now this threat has been assessed and given a name and given a face. And now I have a way to simply rot out my anxiety. And this simultaneously is happening alongside a disparity of death, whereby African Americans, because of racial discrimination that determines where and how they live, and ultimately the types of health conditions that they experience, um, hypertension typically coincides with the existence of food deserts. Asthma typically coincides with the degree of air particulates that exist within a geopolitical environment. Black and brown communities are more likely to live in food deserts and places with high concentrations of air toxins. So therefore, these underlying conditions are preceded by the underlying condition of racism. If we look at racism in and of itself as an underlying condition, it is a condition that we need to solve first before we can get to the ways in which social events or pandemic events like COVID impact groups of people. So when it comes to the experiences of Asians in COVID, it's important to think about how it's intrinsically linked to the disparity of death within COVID. How do we increase diversity hiring? It's not as easy as making a statement on human resources staff. Yeah, that isn't as easy, but it's also a reality of recognizing the processes in which people get hired. If ultimately we're looking at creating a teaching cohort and staff to represent the compositional diversity of students, we also need to think about the decision makers within policy orientations, also reflecting that same demographic shift. So ultimately, our recruitment and retention efforts at all levels need to reflect a commitment to diversity. This means sending recruiters to HBCUs and HSIs to recruit teachers. This also means to give scholarships to those teachers to then further their education and come back as administrators. Again, thinking of what it looks like to advance teacher demographics, it can't just simply be a recruitment strategy. It needs to be a recruitment strategy that is structural. So it's not just simply recruiting Black and brown teachers, it's recruiting Black and brown administrators, recruiting people who work at the district level, at the state level, that have demonstrated a commitment to diversity and inclusion. It also means that within your diversity statement in your recruitment efforts, there has to be a statement or a measurement or evaluation capability of someone's commitment to diversity and inclusion. So in that sense, it's not we are committed to diversity and inclusion. It is when we are looking at job announcements, it is requiring in a cover letter someone to detail how they have committed themselves to the promotion of diversity and inclusion, and making that standard across a district, and also incentivizing hiring. While you may not get teacher buy-on for a higher salary for people recruited from diverse populations, what you can do is create a specific role that is geared towards teaching teachers and creating policy that is ultimately inclusive. Essentially, we don't just need diversity champions at institutions of higher education, we need them at primary and secondary school. We need directors of diversity and inclusion at primary and secondary schools, and that to be a part of how we understand wraparound services. How can we create culturally responsive teaching environment and hold teachers accountable without being punitive?
Wait, Devin, there's
Oh,
a
yes.
question that came in beforehand in the Q&A. I'm sorry, that was that before that one was curious about the data you found in educational apartheid and what programs are being tested that have seen some success in minority communities.
I cannot necessarily speak to that intentionally, but I will say the previous presenter demonstrated a great example with the Peru School and how they are committed to diversity of not only educators, but of within education. Even the hours that their students go to school reflects community needs. In that sense, their students are going to school during the same hours that the parents are working. So finding childcare isn't as much of an issue. And thinking about structural solutions to structural problems such as that then creates a high opportunity of success, because the load of stress that the family itself is experiencing is diminished. And when we look at some of the KIP programs, for instance, we see similar structural interventions that recognize student needs. We also see, I think there's a couple of schools across the country that are gender specific and intentionally focusing on Black young men being taught by Black young men, showing the same success rate. So one thing that I think research has shown is that when institutions respond to structural vulnerabilities, student outcomes become better. And that when compositional apartheids are subverted by the overrepresentation of historically underrepresented populations, the types of connections that students have with congruence to their teachers allows those students to be more successful because they're able to communicate within and beyond their cultural lexicon. And I think there's a number of studies that show that Black teachers aren't just good for Black students, but they're good for all students. So while I can't necessarily cite the literature verbatim, I'm pretty sure it's easy to find.
Okay, then go back to the, thank you for answering that.
You're welcome.
How can we create a culturally responsive teaching environment and hold teachers accountable without being punitive or making them feel like they are quote unquote bad teachers?
Oh, so speaking of that, this book is great. In talking about the types of blind spots and really the potentiality of implicit association when it comes to impacting biased decision-making. So I think a part of the answer to that question is to recognize the normality of implicit bias. If someone is making a biased decision that they're not cognizant of, it's important to recognize that as not being their intention. So if we can cultivate a culture of diversity training that recognizes implicit biases and brings those to the forefront of our intellectual discovery, then we can collectively work together to produce practices and behaviors that interrupt those processes. To give an example, I recently did a diversity training at Kaiser talking about Black infant mortality and mothering death. And I asked a number of questions that responded to the community of healthcare practitioners that I was engaging. And I simply, since the majority of them were women, I asked how many women have had an idea outright rejected before even being processed by a community of predominantly men. Some people raised their hands, some didn't. I then asked how many people have had an idea stolen or rejected by a community of men and then stolen by a man and then validated as theirs and not necessarily yours. A good number of them raised their hands. And I asked how many of you have been yelled at or disrespected publicly in a professional environment. A good number of them raised their hands. Then I said, for the men in the room, that is how implicit bias works. Ultimately, chances are you were amongst those who participated in this, but either didn't recognize it or weren't accountable to it because this was something that was normal and natural. And for the women in the room, it's important to understand how empowering it is for you to be validated within this reality, but also recognize that this is something that Black women have experienced by groups that reflect the majority people in this room. And using those types of processes where people can commit to an experience that they can share and then translate that experience to the ways in which bias impacts vulnerable population creates a counter stereotype process that research has demonstrated is more likely to be successful than implicit bias in and of itself. It also allows us to create a type of commitment to the training that incentivizes people to become learners by ultimately prioritizing intellectual humility through that commitment of a shared understanding. So um, that's my personal method when thinking about implicit bias. So what I would say is that once we in any type of institutional environment or professional development opportunity can create consistent and intentional trainings that seek to create that type of experiential learning where people can emotionally connect to the material that's being presented, it allows a better training outcome. But the reality is that it has to be integrated into the culture. Like we have to have reading groups, we have to have diversity development trainings, we have to incentivize those trainings, and we have to go across professions when doing this. It can't just be teachers, it has to be doctors, lawyers, professors, all coming together to all have the same types of training so that it's taken outside of the environment of comfortability and then allows people to kind of test their knowledge through interaction with other professional groups that are similarly aligned in the objective of diversity and inclusion training. That's why in the cultural humility piece, I said community partnerships, because ultimately, let's say First Five is dedicated to the first 5 years of birth, and Kaiser has outreach that is developed towards an assessment of ACEs. Well, if First Five and Kaiser have a partnership with an elementary school, now we have community partners that have an objective to reduce the impact of ACEs and create resources that help students to be successful at the community level that go beyond what the school itself is able to provide. And so what I'm saying is that there has to be a structural system of engagement to deal with structural issues. In the same way, we have to think about increasing diversity of hires in the same way. We need a structural intervention. It's not just teachers that we need to recruit. We need to recruit administrators. We need to recruit policymakers. We need to create community organizations that could help incentivize the types of recruitment efforts, the types of crowdfunding to provide scholarships, to add to salaries, et cetera. So we're not just reliant on what is it, residential taxes to fund our schools. And that in and of itself reproduces disparity, because property tax um, in neighborhoods that have eroded um, in property value ultimately reproduce disparity in the types of teachers that they can attract. And if not that, how long teachers actually stay in a community. Because that's another thing that we recognize, is that even well-to-do teachers don't necessarily stay in at-risk communities. They put in their 2 to 5 years and then go somewhere where they can get paid more. And that is a structural reality due to the fact that home ownership is tied to quality of education. And people of color are less likely to own homes. And increasingly now, when the debt structure means that someone like me with a PhD who has $200,000 of debt is going to find a difficult time in purchasing a home, let alone living in an environment where the student outcome for kids that look like me is actually good. And that, even for somebody like me, reproduces the types of disparities that I was only um, through, the only thing that I can consider reality is luck. It was only luck that I was able to get this far in life. I mean, the emotional impact of having a, a principal tell me that I should drop out of school, and being recommended for special education. Um, if if that happened to me, someone who actually became successful, it's important to recognize that I'm one of the lucky ones that was able to make it out. And not too many people are fortunate. I would say the majority of people are not as fortunate as me. But I was not the most talented of the cohort of Black students that I was educated amongst within my primary education. Um, so to answer the question more concisely, once we create a culture of diversity training where it is normalized and we highlight humility, then people won't feel attacked as being bad. They'll simply look at an opportunity to simply learn and be engaged. And they'll have a community of partnerships behind that learning and engagement. And that's also how we can develop a sense of recognizing blind spots, looking at the second question: what are some categories with disaggregated data that many community colleges are missing? Ooh, I don't understand the first part of that question. What are some categories? Yeah, I don't understand the first part of that question, particularly concerning non-binary. Okay, there we go. The second part helps. Particularly concerning non-binary identified students, do we have a sense of other blind spots? Well, when we think about applications, what are the gender markers that are being used? When we think about the construction or the layout, where are non-binary accessible restrooms located? When we think about how Banner or whatever enrollment management system people are using, do they offer opportunities for pronouns? Do they offer opportunities for nicknames? Not everybody is able to change their legal name, which in the state of California, if you change your legal name, then the institution has to respect that. But for folks who have not, because of means or because of fear for other types of violence and very real fears, they may not change their names or their data, and therefore they'll be called a name that they don't identify with and ultimately be receiving violence. And this is something that's not necessarily unique to community college. It happens at undergraduate professional schools and in K through 12. So when that becomes the reality, then that is a blind spot. Simply not giving people an opportunity to identify as they have identified themselves through our enrollment management, through access to bathrooms, and through how they're identified by their teachers, how they may be misgendered and have to experience structural violence from those that they are supposed to come to receive knowledge that allows them to matriculate. It's important to think about how that stress weighs on their success. So those are some of the blind spots that I can think of off the top. But the reality is that this is something that requires consultation and assessment from experts like myself that do this type of work. I'd also say that there are a number of organizations that do provide free material and consultations on this. So when we think about, simply how do we honor the wholeness of a student, once we can critically engage the answer to that question, then we're going to be able to pull out some of our blind spots and make intentional efforts to correct some of the things that we typically miss out on. That is a problem because people are hiring top are white, and the most I call the green light because people aren't of color. Yeah, so again, once we can incentivize organizational relationships with HBCUs, with social justice organizations, then we can create new hiring pathways that is more intentional to create an intervention on the types of people that we hire to teach, to be administrators, and to be policymakers that impact the education of our students. What is the title of the book? The one that I showed is Blind Spot by Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. And those are the two scholars that created the implicit association test. I agree with him. Michelle Obama made it a point at the top law firm she worked with to seek outside talent, the top school, and look predominantly Black colleges. Yeah, so we just need to be more creative and intentional about our hiring networks and the relationships that we create. Oh, thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that. The pitiful part of all this is that you, as you said, are preaching to the choir. Those who really need to hear your words are not at all present. Well, one thing I like about preaching to the choir is that it amplifies the gospel. And that when you preach to the choir and the choir delivers the message of the gospel, then the gospel is able to go further than preaching would ultimately dictate. So what I would say is that there's nothing wrong with preaching to the choir, because if, let's say, 39 people currently are still listening to this presentation, then that is 39 more people than myself who can deliver the insight that they were able to glean from this presentation. And if they then talk to 2 people, then we have an exponential increase of people who have the appropriate framework to deal with structures of oppression in the way in which they impact learning environments. So I don't think preaching to a choir is at all a bad thing, because at the end of the day, it is the allies that are going to do the work. And when the allies can create more allies, then we can work together to create these types of solutions. Good point, but I feel that we are going to.
You have 1 minute left, so.
Oh, great.
If you could wrap it up, and this will be post-recorded. This is recorded, so everyone will get an email link to this recording.
So again, to reiterate, there's nothing wrong with preaching to the choir. It's important that these ideas and these thoughts get out. For those who refuse to listen to it, It never is, nor will it ever be about them. The reality is that once we can normalize these conversations, then they're going to have to listen, because this is going to be at the forefront of what change looks like, and they're going to have to be a part of change in order to be relevant. So my response is always keep on preaching to the choir, start recruiting more choir members, and continue to advocate, continue to voice concerns, continue to build relationships, especially where resources don't exist. And this work has to continue, because if it doesn't, then the majority of students will come of age in a world of disparity, and that will negatively impact our nation. And that also needs to reflect our commitment, is that if we continue in the way in which we're going, then the majority of Americans will be negatively impacted, and we will have a limit to the success that will allow our country to thrive. So if everyone isn't on board with that, then they will ultimately be left behind. So thank you.